it's upon you. I'm 18. Like, do I go to school?
A lot of young people leave high school with really, really vague notions about what they're going to do. And part of it is the economy, right? Jobs and even occupations that we're doing right now did not exist.
What things need to happen from young person, whatever age, to emerging into adulthood?
It is important to develop a sense of responsibility, both for yourself, but then eventually for others.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Good People, episode 59. Today's guest is Dr. Monica Kirkpatrick Johnson. She is a professor of sociology and the department chair at Washington State University. In today's episode, expect to learn from Monica about all of her research on the transition from adolescence to adulthood, the importance of getting an education for economic outcomes, why we need to talk to young people more about the potential career paths in front of them, and some of the most important characteristics for leading adolescents into adulthood. If you guys are on YouTube, before the show begins, please consider commenting, and subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. Without further ado, my conversation with Monica was awesome. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so tell me, when did you become fascinated with the transition from adolescence to adulthood?
Yeah, I think it started when I was in graduate school. Partly by opportunity. I was working on a study as a part of my research assistantship while I was in graduate school. And the project was on a cohort of young people. It was originally designed to study the effects of employment during high school. And that cohort was growing up. And so while I was in grad school, they were making their way through their 20s. And so some of the projects we did got me interested in, the different pathways that those young people were taking out of high school.
I was going to say, it's just so fascinating to me how often I speak with researchers and professors, and I mean, everybody else in general. Like, I've talked to athletes and business owners, and their thing that they kind of have is always usually been birthed out of this kind of right place, right time thing, where you were just kind of going through the motions and you were in the right spot and this thing kind of happened, and then that was your interest. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's, kind of a glib answer to what I'm interested in is often, well, whatever I'm working on, because it usually captures my attention and I'm intellectually curious. So I just, so part of it came from that. And then I was also very, when I went to graduate school, I was interested in gender, and I was interested in the things that were happening with social change. And so, young women had just surpassed young men in going to college at the time that I was in graduate school. And at the time, there had been kind of a partial revolution in, family and work life, in that women had entered the labor force. And so there were these massive changes. And we didn't know at the time that it was going to stall out, and that the changes wouldn't also then encompass men to the same extent. But I was really curious about what young women wanted and whether or not they would end up following the paths that they wanted, or if they would, sort of be to some extent channeled into different kinds of opportunities in this, changing landscape.
Mm. What's the why? Like, why is it this transition that's so fascinating for you? I know it was like the right place, right time, but when you kind of can nail it down, what is the why?
I think because it changes in ways that both reflect social forces, like what's happening in history and what's happening in the economy. So there's these big things that are happening that shape what happens in this life stage. And it's also a time in which we're making big choices. So for me, it's a combination of this idea that we are on the river, and the river has contours to it, but we are also actors, and we get to within that, we get to make some choices, and this life stage is one where we make big choices about what's going to happen, right? We often decide to go to school longer or not, or enter a training program, or take a job, or choose a life partner, have children. These are things that are not necessarily ones that aren't reversible. You can go back to school later, but it's harder if you have to change course later. And some of them are harder to reverse. So it's a pivotal point in which we translate what our childhood lives are like in our families into what our adult lives are going to look like.
That's really interesting. I've obviously thought about the pandemic and like the lockdown specifically and what it did for me. And, personally, I had a great experience with that. I lived at home with my family, got to hang out with my older brother who we had been apart for a couple of years because we were both in college. But I never really connected the dots until you just said that with freedom now is something that I care a lot about, because when we were locked down, it was like a wake up call, like, oh, wow, we can't, like, yeah, I might not always have this. Like, let's enjoy the ability to like just go do something, right? Because for a time, for one reason or another, it was something that was taken away from me. So that's interesting that you brought that up. That just kind of jogged my memory. For me, that was literally the age of 20 to 21 was going through the pandemic. So yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in how these big changes, like historical events, can really shape how a group of people at the same kind of life stage then experience their lives. So the sort of origin research from the tradition that I work in was about children growing up during the Great Depression and how their lives were shaped by that experience, depending in part by whether or not they were, young children or teenagers. So, the kinds of pressures and difficulties as well as opportunities that they faced really depended on whether or not they were teens or they were really young and really affected by the family. And so, yes, if you graduate during a recession, it matters. If if you're locked down in the pandemic and you're in your transition to college, or you are coming back from college, or if you are in high school, if you're at that stage where you're supposed to be figuring out romance and you have a 2-year, or even a year change in your interactions with people, it can shape what you and your age mates then experience and sort of what your trajectories look like.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Like how many parents or grandparents have people stuff money under mattresses still, or like have this weird stash of gold from growing up in the recession, right? Like that's
Yeah.
I didn't think about the context of it expanding over the life course.
Yeah.
How would you define this transition? Like what are the specific characteristics that define this time period?
There's a couple of things that I look at it. It's multifaceted. And so I view it as a transition, like a period or a stage in our lives. And it's marked by events. But it's also marked by maturation processes that are not as easily identifiable as events, right? So age itself is multifaceted. We use it easily, right? And we usually mean by it chronological age, like how many years have you been living on this planet? But that's kind of a proxy for other things that are happening that are biological, right? Our bodies are aging. It's psychological. So our cognitive capacities and our views and our identity is changing. And it's also social. So we have things like laws that define when we can drink and when we can drive, and or are eligible for social programs later in the life, So there are legal things, and then there's cultural significance that we attach. So if we think of age as being multifaceted, I think it helps us think of this transition period as multifaceted. So demographers, or the people who study population patterns, will focus usually on 5 specific transitions. So it's leaving school, entering the workforce, usually they look at full-time employment, leaving the parental home, marrying, and having children. And over time, marrying has, encompassed more of, forming a relationship that's intended to be permanent, not necessarily marriage. So they've looked at those as a way of trying to see, how long is this period in the life course for people who grew up during one time versus, people who grew up during another time. What is the order in which those things happen? What combinations do people hold? So those are important. But we also look to things that are psychological and social in terms of, whether or not you feel like an adult, whether or not you engage in adult behaviors, you make choices that reflect the maturity we expect of adults. And then there's social, relations as well. When relationships with parents change, and you're making more of your own choices, and maybe you're responsible for things. They're not only independent, but you actually have responsibilities to others, right? So, it's everything from the big stuff all the way down to sort of in American culture. Do you get to sit at the adult table for Thanksgiving, right? Or are you still in with the kids that are, at the card table in the other room or something like that? There's just so much to it, and it's a two-way street, right? So that for most of us, there's a certain level of skill, responsibility, sort of self-assurance that allows us to make choices to take on big roles, like becoming a parent or taking a full-time job or something like that. At the same time, those things like being a parent and having work, they help us grow up. And they help us become responsible. So these social and psychological things go hand in hand with these like adult social roles, like employer or employee, parent, partner.
Is there a difference, male to female here? Like I would imagine so, but some of those things that you mentioned seemed like there's a pretty obvious crossover. Both men and women get married, both men and women are employed, etc.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to say about that. In general, both men and women are going through the same things. And any of the research we do on how, for example, your identity as an adult is influenced by becoming, a spouse or becoming a worker or any of that, that all seems to go in parallel. It's not so much gendered, but where the gender differences do lie is in the timing, and to some extent in the combination. So women and men have somewhat converged in how early they start their families over time, but women still tend to partner a little bit earlier, at a little younger age than men do, and they have children at a little bit younger age than men do. They're staying in school longer than men now, as they've surpassed in college going rates. So the timing of these transitions does still look somewhat different for young men and women, but in a larger historical swath of 50 or more years, young men and young women's lives look more alike now than they did before.
Is that why you suppose that is? Because of historically the differences, or could it be like the development of females is generally happens a little bit earlier? I'm just kind of spitballing here.
Yeah, I think that my view is looking, sort of at a long part of history, as well as the short-term changes we've had, is that economics drives a lot of it. So, if women are not economically responsible for themselves or for others, then they are able to, become a wife earlier. Whereas men, if that's a criteria, or if they have to wait until they inherit the property from their fathers, if you look further back in history, those things, those economic pieces have always been critical to family formation in particular. So, marrying and then having a child, especially if you do it in that order. So I think economics has a lot to do with it. So, and women's roles in society have changed with the economy as well. So when have we needed two earners in the family, for families to, have a basic standard of living? And then with that, women were going to school, and education shaped views, right, about egalitarianism. So now we have, women aspiring to different things than they did in earlier generations.
Right. Why is this such a crucial time? Something that you mentioned earlier that struck a chord with me is, so I'm 20, I just turned 24. I'm getting ready to get married in October this year. And I've always just kind of visualized my life as this like tree branch of opportunity, right? There's so many different ways that you could go. And I'm starting to feel like I'm getting very narrow. Like, obviously I still have a lot of, autonomy and the ability to choose many different versions of any sort of life that I could lead. But with a lot of these big life decisions that you just mentioned, I've left school, I've started working full time, I'm getting married. You know, we're not buying a house yet, but that is something on our mind in the next couple of years. I imagine that's probably another one of those big decisions. I'm sort of starting to solidify. I've effectively cut like half of the branches off of the tree. At least the ones that I can foresee myself like actually going down. It seems like that is kind of the big thing here. Is like, this is such an important point in life because it does narrow the course of it down probably more drastically than any other point in your life.
Yes, and so I think part of what happens is that, for example, your marriage, or even in this period of time before that, where you have a person who's in your life, stably in your life, right? Now, any choice you would make is one that affects that person as well, right? So it's not that you couldn't go back to school and train for a completely different career, but in doing so, it's harder, right? It's harder because then it shapes that person's life. For many people, it's harder because they may not have any financial or material support from their parents if they go back to school later, right? So they're simultaneously trying to figure out, how do I support myself, possibly others, at the same time that I want to make this new choice. So the American system and sort of the American ideology promotes this: you can make any choice you want at any time, it's never too late. And to some extent, our institutions are changing to catch up with that, right? You really can go back to school later, or you can get divorced and remarry, which wasn't as available 100 years ago. At the same time, it doesn't mean those things are very open, right? The process through which you would take, going from one path and go to a completely other path, there's a lot of resistance and a lot of cost to it compared to when you're making that choice at 18 or 20 or 24. So your momentum, and how much you'd have to backtrack to get on another branch of that tree, to use your analogy, becomes harder. But we also see more people changing careers at midlife now than we used to. So it's both a flexibility of the life course that we've seen in over the decades, but it doesn't mean it's a completely open thing. Like you said, you feel like your paths are sort of coming into focus, so that you're like, okay, I still have these choices, but to go way over here, that would be big.
Yeah, right. My question is in line with the sort of psychological things that one experiences when they go through this transition period. And just to kind of bring up what you just said, I've talked to somebody on the show. It was a kind of a philosophical discussion about occupational anxiety or decision fatigue type stuff, where, 300 years ago, if my father was a blacksmith, I would likely be a blacksmith. There was none of this like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. Like, how many people who are in their 40s and 50s who have, gone through their career are still like, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up, to bring up your most recent point, there's just so many things that we could do. And we're told that, right? Your whole life is up to you. You can make these choices whenever you want. You can make a 360 and get divorced and move across the country and start a new career doing whatever, right? Um, and so I would imagine that there are probably some differences with some of the psychological pressure that one experiences nowadays versus 200-300 years ago.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And one way to look at it is to say we have the freedom of choice, but we also have the burden of choice, right? So we actually there's no real default. We actually have to actively choose, and not choosing in some ways is a choice, right? We are, um, you know, constantly needing to weigh the pros and cons, or the costs and benefits, or how we feel, how do we see ourselves in the future, to craft our own life, as opposed to sort of it being something where some things are a given, right? This will happen. I'd actually have to actively find another path. um, if you were a young woman who did not want to marry in the 1800s, what is it that you would do? Well, you'd have to figure out something, and there's not obvious opportunity to do that for most young women. So yes, we have that burden of doing this. And something you said about trying to figure out what I want, who I am, I do think that that's become a lifelong project. So there are philosophers, as well as social psychologists, who talk about how we now think of our lives as a project, rather than, something where we do what's expected of us. I think my grandparents, for example, if they thought of, was I a good wife, was I a good father, would think, well, a father does A, B, and C, and I did those, so I'm good. Whereas we have a much more complicated sense of what we need to do in those roles, and whether we were happy and fulfilled in those roles. And so we have this, like I said, capacity, but also burden to make our life meaningful in a complicated way, and sort of keep a narrative going. um, so I think that's partly what's fascinating about it, and to bring it back around to those big changes we were talking about at the beginning. I think there are these wonderful intersections between what's happening in the world, or in our countries, that intersect with that project that we are doing, where we're building what our life is, and how it has meaning.
Hmm. Do you think that burden of choice is more or less advantageous?
Mm, I think, you know, I look at a lot of things through the lens of who has resources. So I think it probably depends a lot on whether or not you have resources to provide yourself time to figure that out, resources to actually pursue the opportunities that we see might be out there. Even to see them, takes resources. So I think it can be both. I think it can be a real burden for young people who don't have resources and don't see viable paths in front of them. Whereas for others, they have the resources to take the time and explore. When they mess up, they have resources to backtrack and try something different. And we don't have much of a collective approach to that in our country. And that fits with other aspects of who we are as Americans. But it also means that if you don't have your own or your family's resources to fall back on or use in order to sort of craft this life, there isn't a lot to catch you when you make missteps, and maybe you don't even feel like you can risk some things because
Yeah.
there isn't something on the other side.
For some individuals, it probably feels kind of like an exciting type of eustress where, you're under a lot of pressure, but the whole world's in front of you. While for others, it's like, man, if this doesn't work, I'm screwed.
Yeah. And I think there's more attention to thinking about this period of time. For example, in research on like employment changes and career building in the, early adulthood, there's more attention to thinking of this time as, freedom and flexibility on the one hand, right? You can try things out. But you can also look at those same changes as floundering, right? Trying to get a foothold in the labor market and actually be able to make enough money to be able to have a family or be able to stably have, rent or buy a home or something like that.
Mm. You obviously mentioned, resources, but what are some of the, key characteristics that will sort of decide if this transition is, by whatever metric, successful or unsuccessful?
Yeah, so the metric probably matters, in terms of, are we looking for sort of a state of well-being, or are we looking for economic, success or something like that? Being able to meet your own aspirations and expectations is one of those factors. Another one is sort of being able to, establish yourself in the major adult role successfully, right? Can you support yourself? Have you found someone, as long as that's what you want, have you found someone to partner with? And if you want children, have children. And the factors that really predict that have to do with increasingly with a college degree. Education has always mattered in terms of like what jobs you can take and how much money you will make. And whether or not you go to college has always reflected your family's resources, right? But interestingly enough, since about the 1970s, the gap between people who get college degrees and those who do not get college degrees has widened in terms of the economic payoffs and also in terms of marriage rates and being able to raise children with two adults. So increasingly, the dividing line between opportunities, at least by those markers, is going to college. And so, we can then look at the precursors to those. Who's going to college, right? We know that parents' financial and educational backgrounds matter a lot for that. We also know that women are doing that in larger numbers than men. We know there are racial and ethnic differences in who's doing that. And as a country, we can respond to that in a couple of different ways. One is that we've had this, college for all philosophy. Like, let's try to get more and more people to go to college. And there's some value in that, but the darker side of that is that it continues and maybe even exacerbates the devalue of other paths that we haven't, made as viable. So when I mentioned that the economic payoff to college has grown, so even though you always would have made more on average if you finished high school than if you didn't, or if you finished college instead of high school, that gap widened. It didn't widen because college graduates got increasing returns. It actually widened because what you could make without a degree eroded. So those who, drop out of high school, or those who finish high school but don't go on to college, or even those who attend a 4-year college but don't get a diploma, as opposed to maybe going and getting a 2-year degree, the wages of those people have gone down over time, and and with it, a lot of family life as well. So a lot more economic barriers to being able to, marry and have a family if that's what you want. So we have not paid as much attention as a country to the paths of that group. About maybe a decade ago, there was a report that referred to this group as the forgotten half, right? There's about half of young people in the US who don't attempt to go to college. And that number's a little bit older number, but what are the paths for that young person? we have kind of a mismatch or a mismatch of things all over the country, right? There's some things you can do with a high school diploma, but that's becoming harder and harder, especially as the manufacturing sector has declined and we're not doing as much manufacturing in the U.S. But then we have this whole set of possible certificates, trainings, VOTEC schools, other, short-term programs, for profit, not for profit, and they differ across state. They're regulated differently across state. You can go to, cosmetology school in one place and it's not the same as another place, or, the different kinds of training programs are not, they're not the same across locations. They're not very well understood by young people. They almost have to go figure that out for themselves, as opposed to, hey, there's this college path, here's what you do. Even first gen students, we're increasingly paying attention to the fact that they may not have all of the same awareness of how things work in an institution, but we've paid attention to it and we've started to think about what it means to help educate first gen students in college. But the other paths out of high school are tricky because many of them don't pay very well, and that's increasingly the case. And also, it's not very well known to young people. What are the range of things I could do, and what are the training routes to get into them? And do I need an apprenticeship, or do I need to, get this, technical skill built, and so on.
What would you suppose is a good way to kind of increase that awareness? Because this is something that I've been giving a lot of thought to lately. I by no means regret going to college, but I have a bachelor's degree in communication studies, and I talk to a lot of people on the show about it. I still regularly engage in this kind of dialogue a lot. I'm really fascinated by this area of research. But yeah, like I think about it a lot. I love doing things with my hands. I probably would have loved doing some sort of trade. Like not to say again that I did anything wrong necessarily, but there was a ton of things that I could have been interested in. And when I was in high school, at least, those paths seemed kind of like low level dumb person thing to do. And obviously they're not, because it's like now that I'm an adult and if like something breaks at my house or the breaker goes out, I have to call somebody to come help me do it. Right. It's just a different thing. And so what do you suppose are some ways to sort of increase awareness? And I know we mentioned, like a vocational school or something like that, a trade school. Are there any other paths like military or anything else that you think would be viable routes for people to consider?
Yeah. So military and college are two routes that share a lot in common, actually, because in many ways, especially for those who go to four-year institutions for college, in many ways, those systems kind of envelop the young person. And you've got healthcare and social life and all these things that kind of come together in a package, right? And no other path has that, right? Where it sort of fits you with a social group, for your friendships and social needs, meeting partners. And then you've got a lot of this sort of way that you move through it together as a new, enlisted person or as a college student and so on. And the other paths, we don't have actually very much structured support for. So we have made some moves in recent years to make it more clear when people are entering training programs, what credentials they'll get, what the employment rate of people with those credentials is. There's been pressure, especially, to make sure that when people pay for or go into debt trying to get training, that they're not just being duped, right, at the extreme, that there is a viable career path on the other side. And that's true, but I do think we have to pay attention to what, our, minimum wages are, our tax policies are, that make those positions economically okay decisions to make, right? We need to narrow that gap, and there's a variety of ways to do it, right? And we have a lot of conflicting ideologies in the U.S. about the best ways to do that. But ultimately, people who are in a lot of jobs that we need to be able to make a living out of it, right? Now, some of those you can actually do quite well, right? But we still have this idea, and it varies across communities. But we have this idea that it's a lesser choice, right? And we know that other models exist out there. There are plenty of models in Europe, for example, where there is more established apprenticeship programs and things where there is, training combined with schooling, and the occupations that you prepare for are respected. It's not viewed as oh, wait, your kid's not going to college, or, oh, sorry, mom and dad, I'm, I really don't want to do this. It's actually like, oh, no, this is something that suits me. So the more we can kind of pay attention to that and make it an okay decision, or to not immediately enter a 4-year program if that's not something that's clear yet as a path for you. I know my parents were a little bit nervous. I went straight to school. My sister went straight to school. My brother was like, I'm going to do something else. He ended up later getting degrees, but the gap year idea was a little bit scary at the time. Maybe a little bit less so now. I think the pandemic helped with that, actually, ironically. But, a straight through path is not necessarily the best one for everyone. And those other options that are not college, need people in them, and they need to be valued.
Right. It kind of sounds a little bit convoluted because there's the time frame for that is it's upon you. I'm 18. Like, do I go to school? And obviously, we have these conversations somewhat leading up to it, but I almost feel like some of this stuff needs to happen probably well before that, like coming of age, like as ridiculous as it sounds as a parent, if you have children, kind of finding what they're gifted at and encouraging that and telling them that this is a fine option. Would you say that it's kind of more on the family unit, or is this like a societal, perhaps even like, legislative kind of thing that we need to interfere with?
Well, in the U.S., I think we largely leave it up to families. Schools certainly do introduce young people to some options, right? When you're little, you might have career day where parents come in and give you a variety of experiences. I know my children both opted into the, let's go drive with the bus driver and see what the bus driver's day is like, as well as, the veterinarian that they got to go with. So there's ways that we introduce it systematically, but a lot of that exploration is on the young person's part individually or in families. There are, and again, varying across schools, there are certainly opportunities to take career and technical classes in most of our, comprehensive high schools. So you can take metal shop or things like that. And some of those even have partnerships with the private sector, where there are, ties you can make with employers informally, if not formally. But another model, would be Germany, where there is a government structured, system of recognized occupations with pay rates and apprenticeship requirements. And, so it could be at the societal level. And we tend to have it be quite individual on the continuum between, formally structured and left up to the individual. We're not all the way there, because we do some things in schools, and we do regulate institutions that train and teach. But we do leave a lot of it up to young people. And, most Americans would be pretty hesitant to say we should track kids really young too, right? We like this open system of, hey, you're a late bloomer. You may not seem like you're on a true sort of intellectual academic path, so we'll divert you into this kind of high school. And most Americans are like, ooh, what if it seems a little too permanent, right? So we aren't as attracted to models that they use in Europe, where there's more tracking early. On the other hand, a lot of young people leave high school with really, really vague notions about what they're going to do. And part of that is, our approach, and part of it is the economy, right? Jobs and even occupations that we're doing right now did not exist, when we were in grade school. And it's a fast changing, and in some ways, for those who do go into college, the kinds of skills they need are not known practical skills. It's learning how to learn and learning how to do things so that in 15 years, they're still able to do the new things that we can't even anticipate what they are right now, which is probably why your communications degree is hugely valuable, right? Is that it taught you things not so that you can go write an essay on some specific thing right now or pass a test on something right now, but it taught you things so that now and in 10 years and in 15 years, you are able to navigate all of that and be productive, right?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. Like I'm a fitness coach, and I specifically coach weightlifting. This kind of ties into what I was going to say, to the model of like some European countries. That's very obvious to me in sport, especially a lot of like Russian Eastern Bloc countries will hand pick the elite weightlifters based off of their body proportions and train them very rigorously from a young age. And I think, at least from an American perspective, that's kind of an abhorrent way to grow up, right? And you know, that's actually one of the reasons why like the United States in the Olympics would struggle and has struggled for many years against Russians, because the people that we're sending to the Olympics started it when they were like 19 or 20 or whatever, right? And I think obviously that's why the family value thing seems more appealing, because it's like, okay, we, to bring up like the cost or the burden of having all these choices, it really comes down to, as a parent or as a guardian in charge of these kids, or ushering people through adolescence into adulthood, it really kind of comes down to us, and obviously it's the individual who's going through it as well, but to ensure that transition is productive and they're fulfilled and they're happy ultimately. I can't remember what we were just talking about. What did you just say? I was telling you about it doesn't matter. Another question that I have is from an educational perspective. Obviously, this is a very important factor when it comes to a successful transition. Are there any other underlying things below that will contribute to whether or not somebody gets a good education or has a successful transition? Is there specific familial values that you could point to? Obviously, probably socioeconomic status of the family has something to do with it. Are there any other things that are worth pointing out?
Yeah, certainly there's, socioeconomic status is usually things like the parents' education level, and that comes out in terms of resources, but also in terms of values, right? Often putting school as a high priority, and supporting academic efforts. And then of course, income makes a huge difference, not just in affording higher ed, but in, what kids do in their summers. And other kinds of things. A lot of the really interesting research on education gaps shows that schools sometimes do better than we think they're doing, in the sense that the learning rate during the school year, even though students are sometimes at a lower level in lower economic schools, than in higher economic schools, the sort of growth rate is very, very similar. But then in the summer, there's a loss, for kids who are lower income families, and there is either gain or no loss for the middle and upper income families. And it's partly because of what they're still exposed to in the summer, right? They're still exposed to their family and what the family does. And so education and income really do make a big difference. But even at any income level, parents, general parenting as well as their involvement in schools makes a big difference. So if parents can, for example, be in communication with the school, reinforcing, what is needed from the child to do well in school, that always helps. And in terms of general parenting, there's this idea that kids need structure. And structure comes out in a bunch of different terms depending on the research tradition. It could look like control is one of the words that's used, but it has a different connotation than in regular everyday speak. But structure could be control. It could be, discipline. Again, not necessarily punishment. Discipline would mean what you reward and what you encourage, as well as what you don't allow, as well as that sort of emotional thing that that children need. So when kids have some stability, and they are loved, and they have parents who can and are involved, and give them some boundaries and support, they do better, not only in school, but in so many more dimensions of their mental health as well.
Are you familiar with Dr. Tracy Valencourt?
Yes.
Okay, I was just going to bring that up. I've had her on the show early on, probably like a year ago at this point. But the wordage or the verbiage she used to describe that to me was high structure, high support. So obviously she studies the context of bullying, but good health outcomes, good mental, emotional outcomes for children, especially young children, come about by having high structure, high support from their parents. So very much what you're describing, maybe a disciplined or regimented day, or a focus on school or sports, but also sort of freedom to engage in their social circles, explore their interests in various aspects, all the things that you were alluding to earlier. So it's interesting that crossover is there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think some of the conversations about parenting right now, of course, in the media, sometimes things get exaggerated, right? So the idea of the helicopter parent is not the same in reality as it sometimes gets hyped up in the media. But some of the underlying debates we have right now is about providing that structure and providing that support, but still allowing young people to make mistakes and fail and have stress, right? Too much stress is the kind of stress that's negative. But a little stress is actually highly motivating. A little stress means that you prepare. A little stress means that you rise to a challenge and you're like, oh, I did that, right? And so there's, I think some of the modern dilemmas of parenting is that balance of how much, do we protect our kids versus how much do we allow for things to challenge them, right? And to have sometimes them not live up to what they had hoped for or what others expect of them, and then actually go, oh, okay, yeah, when I did that led to that. That's good for me to recognize that happened, and I can make different choices next time. But it's at the same time, it's a very risky time in history to be parenting. I mean, of course, there were other risks for families in earlier generations, but there's some risks that feel very big to parents right now. One is the economic success of their kids, right? Doing poorly in school or dropping out or any of that stuff is scary because the alternatives are not great, as we've been talking about. But also things like, addiction. And we have the sort of, opioid epidemic. And we have these things that are difficult, right? Where you can't let natural consequences happen for the really big stuff, right? Or parents feel like they can't. We could let you mess up and oops, look what happened. You skinned your knee, or you had to sit on the bench, during your ball game because you did whatever you did. But we're also navigating some really scary stuff. And it's an economy in which there's winners and losers, and there's major health risks out there to us. And so I get parents' anxiety, and at the same time, we have to have challenge and we have to have stress to grow as people. And it's important, something that needs to sort of start to happen, as well as independence, right? I mean, so my kids were both still living at home during the pandemic. And one was at the end of 5th grade when it started, and one was the end of 9th grade when it started. And, that period of time are times when they might have been going out and doing things for themselves. And, maybe meeting friends at an establishment where they would make financial transactions, or that they would go places alone, or that, so there were things that just stopped. And my community was one, my state was one in which, took a much more public health version, conservative. Things were closed, schools were closed for a long time. And so some of the things that later, as we started to do, I would think that, a 16 or 17-year-old could do, or a 13 or 14-year-old could do, there had been this stalling out of getting the chance to, interact with a store owner, or getting to interact with, other adults in ways that they did not build that same independence. And so we had to go, oh, wow, let's step back here and think about, how to support that and how to build it and make sure that they are not too protected.
Right. And I think from a societal perspective too, something that gets a little convoluted, and maybe this is because of the interconnectivity of social media, and, it's almost like at some level you can see people's parenting strategy online, like even regular folks who just, post pictures with their kids. And I think there's a little bit of judgment that comes from that. And I think a lot about how my grandpa interacted with me when I was young. And like, I got my first pocket knife from him when I was 10 years old, and all my brothers did. And he got me a shaving kit when I was 14 years old. And I think to say that now is kind of weird. Like, there's not really this sort of coming of age, rite of passage thing. And the pocket knife is a good example, because I think my grandpa probably got like a shotgun when he was 12. It's not that extreme, right? But when he handed me my pocket knife on my birthday, he was like, listen, buddy, if you cut yourself with this, he's got a little creek that runs by his house. And he was like, we're going to throw your knife in the creek. That's the rule. If you cut yourself, you throw your knife in the creek. And it was sort of this like bestowing of responsibility upon me. And I remember being a little fearful of it. It was enough that made me careful. And it makes me think, and I think even when I was young, and if you asked me a year or two ago, I would have said that stuff wasn't that important. But I have a couple of nieces and nephews now. I'll probably have children within the next decade. And it's something now that I'm being mindful of. Like, there should be sort of these like benchmark establishment of value moments in your life. And I guess the question then becomes, what is going to be effective and what is going to be acceptable? But what's not going to sort of have this rigidity of maybe some other methods, right? And so I guess I don't really know what that is, but it's good to know that this sort of systematic implementation of good values and good character is something that is supposed to happen. And I think more people would probably be better off. I think I turned out okay. I got a good head on my shoulders, and I care about myself, my place in the world, and doing a good job, right? And I think that raising people to have, the mindset to go out into the world like that comes from these little sort of seemingly insignificant things that we get or have bestowed upon us by our elders in a way throughout our lives.
Right. And you probably felt like a vote of confidence, right? By getting that. It was a little scary to get it. But yeah, I do think that there are those moments, and I don't know that we have shared ones right now too much. I think marriage is still that thing. I often hear people tell stories about, before I got married, my dad said this to me, and it was sort of this, okay, it's on you now. But as we push that later and later into, our 20s on as sort of like the middle time point when that's happening, that's a long way in, right? And so you remember the pocket knife, and other stories might, other families might have different stories where they felt that that moment of, oh, okay, yeah, I'm trusted. There's this new thing I get to do, or that for some, it might be being able to stay home alone, or, take care of a sibling, or, and those kinds of things. It seems like it's probably going to vary from family to family at this point in our culture, but I do think that they're important. And I think that's that two-way street I was talking about before between sort of our identity and our emotion and cognition around growing up and the actual events and things, right? When people give us a responsibility, it's both because they see something growing in us, but they also want to foster something in us. And we take that on, right? And we learn from it. So you were afraid to lose your knife. I remember when my brother gave my son a pocket knife, I remember feeling a little bit like, oh, okay, like, are we ready for this, right? And nobody threatened to take it away, but he cut himself, and he learned a lot from that too. Right? He was whittling camping, and nicked his finger, and so obviously no permanent damage, but that was also really good for both of us. To go through those moments. And so, and bringing in some income was likely something is something for some families, and probably was a big deal to some families in historical times, because then you were contributing, to the collective and not just to yourself. So, or responsibility for a pet. So I imagine that there are a lot of different things that can take the place of that, but it's also on us to make those moments that way intentionally.
Do you think that as a society we would be better off by having some pretty explicit ones, or do you think it's still always sort of going to be this up to the family to decide?
Well, we don't not have them, right? There's an age at which you're expected to go to school, and an age of consent, and an age of getting the right to drive and things like that. So we do have some pretty big societal ones that mark that. I certainly there are cultures that celebrate a certain age as a coming of age, and some religions still do that, right, with first communion or confirmation. When I lived in Australia, 21 was a really big deal, and people had parties at 21. 16, 15 or 16 is often sort of a it's no longer a huge rite of passage in the traditional anthropological way, but it's still marked as the the passage into adulthood. And I do think there's some value in that, but I don't see us doing that. In fact, what we have is a confusing hodgepodge of things that happen in your mid to late teens and early 20s. I'll ask my students, when are you adult? They'll say 18. And I'm like, well, why? And they'll say, well, because that's when you can vote and sign a contract. And that's when you can be, held responsibly criminally, right? I'm like, actually, 15-year-olds get tried in adult court, in some states. And you're not allowed to rent a hotel room or rent a car or drink or, so there's this series of things that we have spread out somewhere, in the teens through the mid 20s, where we grant a right with responsibility along there. And those play an important role. We reify those ages then as being important.
I think for me, this is just so eye-opening, and I'm excited in a way to be an uncle and be a responsible adult in a child's life, is because I'm recognizing that these things are important. And I probably won't sit down and put pen to paper and like, at this age, they'll get that, I won't do that. But I think it's good. It's good to know that these things are worth acknowledging and celebrating, and perhaps even having a conversation in a young person's life. Like, hey, you just did this thing, and that's kind of a big deal. Congratulations. But this is now, you've taken a step up on the responsibility ladder. I know this is probably a hard question to answer, but if you could sort of paint, and I know there's probably an innumerable amount of scenarios that we could run through, but if you could sort of paint a check by check box or list of what things need to happen from young person, whatever age, to emerging into adulthood, what are some of those things that you would have on the list? I know we've talked a lot about it kind of over the course of this hour, but just, I guess, in summation.
Yeah, I ideally we'd have multiple pathways open to young people. So I wouldn't say that checklist would be, you know, really specific. I'd probably, focus more on underlying qualities or capacities rather than you should do this and then you should do that. And, I do think that in our society, it is important to develop a sense of responsibility, both for yourself, but then eventually for others. And that is an underlying thing about partnership and parenthood, of course, but I think it is fundamental to so many of the things we do is that we are responsible to others. And that is not something we're capable of as young children, and it has to grow over time. So that, and then also in our society, I think you have to not just be responsible for yourself, but um, find a path that allows you to be economically independent, just because that's the way that our system is set up. We definitely rely on intergenerational exchanges through our lives when things happen. And we get, financial support from our parents. And then, later in life, some parents get help from their children, right? Um, but we do not have a strong safety net. We do not have a lot of tradition or culture of sort of pooling resources beyond the household. So I think young people have to achieve economic independence in our society one way or another. So having some options for what that looks like would be on my list. Yeah, increasingly, I think that some of the things that we need involve um, a awareness and introspection that's hard to put a label on because I think it's newer. We we have to navigate things on our own more than generations that came before us. And I'll just give you one example. It used to be that retirements were set up so that um, you got a defined benefit. When you retired after X number of years at the company, you got a certain payout and it was defined in advance, it was guaranteed. That's what it was. We've largely switched over to a defined contribution. So if you have retirement benefits at all, which is not guaranteed, what that benefit is that you and your employer will maybe match a contribution to a fund, right? But that fund is not guaranteed to be there later. You actually have to, most of the time, you have to manage it, right? Within some kind of structure. The risk is yours. The risk is not the company's. And a lot of other things are like that too. We're moving risk from the collective onto the individual. So when I have a health problem, I got to figure it out. I mean, certainly there's experts that I consult and that will advise me, but I have to advocate for myself and I have to get through a complicated system of insurance and so on, right? So with my retirement and with my health and with my kids' education and all these things, there is that same theme we were talking about in terms of building a life. We have to navigate and be able to understand and make our way through these systems that are increasingly complicated and increasingly they're on our own. So what is it, like, to get back to your list, right? What is it I'm trying to identify? I'm trying to identify a skill of being able to question and look for answers and evaluate information, if it's good information or not. So I really think that kind of thing, as well as an awareness of how we're impacted by what's going on around us. So, for example, when you were talking about sort of having some ages at which you might do things for your kids and recognize certain things, the first thing that came through my mind is one that parents struggle with a lot these days, which is the phone, right? At what age do you bestow the phone? And growing up, I never had to worry about what that device was doing to me or what social media was doing to me, right? But now we're having a national conversation about teenagers and their mental health and what role the mobile phone and social media has in it, right? So there's something about self-regulation and self-awareness that young people need moving into the sort of the adult years, to be able to say, wow, I don't feel good when I do this, or I need to develop habits so that I'm using this in the ways that benefit my life, but that are also not causing me to feel badly about myself, or to, in many different ways. It probably takes a lot of different forms. So the qualities, kind of to pull it together, that I'm concerned with in sort of making this transition are, again, they're kind of squishy. They're not marked by these very specific events, but they're more about, being able to take care of yourself and others financially, being able to support yourself, being ready to make your way through increasingly complicated systems to take care of yourself and others, likely. And then this sort of, self-regulation and awareness of the things that are very beneficial to our lives, but at the same time come with risks that have to be managed.
Right. I just literally, the episode before this is with Dr. Drew Single. He's at UC Davis, and he studies technology, social media, and its effect on adolescent development. And we had this exact conversation, and something that he stated was just that basically the interconnectivity of the high communication world that we live in is just increasing the amount of challenges that young people are facing. Like there's more openness to it. There's more variability to it. And the reason why I named the show Good People is because I think good people live good lives. And in terms of like self-improvement, whatever that means, if you want to get in shape, or you want to have peace in your life, or you want to learn something, ultimately, if you have good values and you sort of fall back on them and apply good character to whatever it is that you are trying to approach, you can generally figure it out and get your way through it. And it kind of sounds like raising productive and good quality people is the same, right? If you're just there to guide them through that confusing, tumultuous path of age 1 to 18, or whenever we define adulthood,
Increasingly later.
right?
Yeah.
They will turn out okay. And obviously, I think most people would agree that perhaps young people are more challenged ever than they have been, just because of that connectivity. And it's okay. It's just kind of the world that we live in. And as I think one of the hopeful things in this regard is that the people who are parents now also grew up in a way. Obviously, I think their kids will probably grow up with even more connectivity, even more integration of technology at some level. But like I got my first cell phone that was a touchscreen smartphone when I was 12. Like Instagram came out when I was 13 or something like that, right? And so I will have the skills, because I went through it at some level, to help my kids or nieces and nephews handle it a little bit better. And I think that that's hopeful.
Yeah, and I largely agree with you. I think the fundamental things that we want to help, our kids with, if as we're parents, or even just collectively this next generation, I do think that those qualities that you talk about in terms of, good people, go a long way to helping everyone create fulfilling lives. I also think that you can do all of that, and you can, even as an individual, not as a parent, but as the young person, really ground yourself that way. And that you can also be at the short end of the stick in terms of the system, right? And so I do think we have some economic things that we have to tackle and we have to figure out. We cannot continue successfully on a path where we have rising inequality. It tears us apart collectively, and there's people at the bottom when you have, sort of a hollowing out of the middle and, an increasing gap between the people who have and have not, it can be somewhat insensitive to just say, well, have good values and do your best, right? Because they can be doing that and still just struggle in ways that other people don't struggle. So I think it's both. I think within these structures, we have to help develop these qualities and priorities and teach them and model them. But then also we do have to, do this stuff about the structure around us too, to make it possible for more people to live good lives.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, where could you point people who may be interested in learning a little bit more about this topic?
There's a couple of good resources. My colleague, Rick Setterson and Barbara Ray wrote a book called Not Quite Adult, which is on this period of time, which is written for a general audience. So it's a good resource. There's also a magazine that the American Sociological Association puts out. So it's written by researchers, but it's a magazine instead of like an academic journal. And it's called Context. And there's an article by Frank Furstenberg and some colleagues called Growing Up is Harder to Do. It's a little bit dated, but it gives the basic picture of how things are changing. And then I have two, web resources that I like. The MacArthur Foundation has a research network on the transition to adulthood. So, their website has more information on reports that have come out. Frank Furstenberg, who I just mentioned, was a part of that network. But my other go-to place that I really like is the Pew Research Center. They do polling and they do other kinds of work. They sometimes use census data and other kinds of things to track trends, but then they will collect new data as well. They have great resources on both adolescents and young adults and what they care about, how they may, how their views sort of look, what are they thinking politically? They cover everything from sort of, what do young people think about climate change or, the use of pronouns and all of this stuff. They have a lot of reports and they have a sort of emphasis that they've had for years on understanding generations. And so a lot of times they'll say, we talk to people who are 20 something right now, and here's what they have to say. And they differ from Gen Xers, right, who are older. But sometimes they're even able to say, back when Gen X's were their age, this is what they thought. And so it really gives you a sense both of what it is about being young, but also about, how the generations are different from each other, and so, and again, that's a outward facing general audience kind of resource. So it's one where it's like reading, a magazine or the news report where you don't have to have a lot of background knowledge to learn a little bit from them.
Good deal. I'll make sure I include all that stuff in the description or show notes for people that are interested in checking it out. But other than that, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, this has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I thank you so much for coming on. I think this was very productive. I think a lot of people will learn a lot. I certainly did. So yeah, thank you, Monica, for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you guys are interested in checking out some of the resources that Monica went over at the end of the episode, make sure you head on down to the show notes below. On another note, I just started a newsletter on Substack called A Little Bit of Good. The link to that is also in the description below. If you're interested in checking that out, I would really appreciate it. If you guys are on YouTube, before you head out, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on our notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. And if while you're listening, you enjoyed, please consider sharing this episode with someone you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.